Welcome to PowerShell Toolmaking with Advanced Functions and Script Modules. You're welcome to sit there, Aaron. Just set that to the side. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mike F. Robbins. I go by Mike F. Robbins online everywhere. I'm a big believer in personal branding. So if you want to send me an email, just send me an email to mikeFrobbins@somewhere.com, like MSN or Gmail or whatever, and you'll probably find me. But I'll give you an official address later in the session. But I'm a Microsoft MVP on Windows PowerShell, and we actually have new titles, but I still say, hey, I'm a PowerShell MVP. I'm also a Sapient Technologies MVP, leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group, co-author of Windows PowerShell TFM 4th edition, author of Chapter 6 in the PowerShell Deep Dives book, winner of the Advanced category in the 2013 Scripting Games. And you're not here to learn about me, but if you're interested, hey, you can learn more about me on my blog at mikefrobbins.com. So I've got some questions for you guys, because I don't want to talk over your head, but I don't want to talk underneath you either. So how many people in the room are IT pros? And what about developers? Okay, and I don't have this on the slide, but what about database administrators? Okay, pretty much the whole room. Which is what I would expect at a SQL Saturday. So who today is using PowerShell actively? Okay, so we've got some new folks and some experienced folks as well. Who's writing one-liners today? And one-liners is how I started writing PowerShell. I started with Exchange 2007. We were an early adopter, so there were a lot of things you couldn't do in the GUI. Back in those days, I was still the dangerous script copy and paster. And when PowerShell 2.0 came out, I started learning more, and I started fabricating these one-liners. And if I couldn't do it in a one-liner, then I just went back to the GUI if it was possible to do it in the GUI. And over time, I built my skills up. So what I want you to take away from that is don't think you can be an expert overnight, because nobody is born an expert at anything. And one of the reasons I don't mind sharing, I can tell you everything I know. And I don't worry about job security, because if I tell you everything I know today, then tomorrow you won't know everything I know, because I'm constantly bettering myself. What I try to do is work about 40 or 45 hours a week, and then I spend another 15 or 20 learning, reading, and bettering myself. So I really work about 60 hours a week, and that sounds like a lot. But what I do is walk on the treadmill in the mornings, do 2 miles, 30 minutes. Hey, I read PowerShell books while I'm on the treadmill, watch videos. So try to multitask. Maybe you're out cutting the grass or something, put a podcast on. Instead of hearing the lawnmower, you can listen to the podcast. So who's writing scripts today? And what about functions? And what about script modules? And who's doing any type of unit testing either on your PowerShell code or your SQL code? Okay, that's something I want you guys to take away from this session as well. What about source control? Who is putting their code in source control? Great. Okay, so the information I've kind of got set to cover in this, and if you have any questions that's outside the scope of this, just ask. All questions are fair game. If it's something that's just way out in left field and I don't want to go that direction in the session, then I'll get you an answer. And I blog a lot. I blog every week. So if it's something that's long and drawn out, then hey, I'll write a blog article about it, because I'm always looking for content. So anyway, we'll talk about readability, which is very important. If you want to get help with your code, if other people like me can't read your code, then I'm not going to help you. If you send me a 1,000-line script and it just runs together and it's not indented, and I'll show you what I mean by this, then I'm just going to go to the next person that's looking for help. So readability. And also you'll think your future self. Instead of 6 months down the road saying, who wrote that garbage? You'll say, man, that guy wrote a good piece of code and I can read it. So we'll talk about naming, we'll talk about parameters, commandlet binding, parameter validation, verbose output, pipeline input, error handling, comment-based help, support should process. I've got a little bit of bonus content. I've got a lot of stuff on here. We're going to cover what we can, but if we don't get to it, I'm going to leave you with plenty of resources, because I only have an hour with you, and you certainly won't be an expert at PowerShell in 1 hour. So the bonus content is the unit testing and the source control. My demo code is already on GitHub. I've made a couple of changes to the slide deck this morning. A couple of errors I found where slides were actually not, I had a couple of images that were not the actual images. They were links to images on the internet. And when I didn't connect to the internet, of course, they didn't work, so I had to fix those. But anyway, in case anybody wants to download the code now, you've got your laptop. Sometimes it's hard to follow along on a projector. Okay, and it's demo time. I'm not a big PowerPoint guy because you don't learn PowerShell looking at PowerPoints. So what we have for this demo environment, we actually have 3 VMs. We've got a Windows 10 machine that's, for the most part, all the defaults. We've got a domain controller running Windows Server 2012 R2 and a SQL Server running 2012 R2. It's running SQL 2014. And both the servers are running Server Core with no graphical user interface. So if you log into them, you're getting a black window and that's it. You shouldn't be managing your servers from the server. You shouldn't RDP into them. There's nothing wrong with using the GUI, don't get me wrong, but if you want to manage a server with the GUI, put the GUI on the management tools on your desktop and manage it from your desktop. Now sometimes you have your servers on an isolated network, and maybe you need to create a server that's almost like a terminal server that's a jump box, and you'll remote into the jump box, and it's for management. That's what it's designed for. But Jeffrey Snover, the chief architect of Windows Server and also of PowerShell, he says that basically the GUI on the server is a disease or cancer, or you get the idea. Okay, so of course you probably can't see this, so and just to show you what versions of PowerShell we're running, I do have PowerShell version 5 on all of these. It's the most recent version. Everything I'm going to show you, I believe, is going to work in PowerShell 4, which is, PowerShell 4 is the default on the servers that I'm running, and PowerShell version 5 is the default on Windows 10. These are heavily commented, and this is in case I get up here and forget what to say, but also if you download the script and you read through it, it'll make sense to you. So anyway, function naming. When you're naming your functions, I recently performed a technical edit on a book before it was released. And the author said, hey, I'm not going to use verb-noun because I'll run into conflicts. Like maybe I have get command or get help or whatever his commands were, and Microsoft's already got those, or what if you write some of those? Well, what I do is prefix my nouns. So my initials are MR, like Mr. for Mike Robbins. So it's pretty cool that I have a Mr. SQL module, and all my commands are get Mr. something. Now, sure, somebody may come up with a conflict for that, but it's highly unlikely. And also, when you import a module, you can actually prefix it. If you have two, I think VMware and Hyper-V, they have some of the same commandlets. But you can actually prefix the commandlets when you do an import of the module. And you'll understand more here shortly. So when you're looking for a verb, it's very important to use an approved verb. If anybody has imported the SQL PowerShell commandlets, then I'm sure you've seen the nasty error message, and I'll actually show you, and this is fixed in the preview version that came out in March, where they're now shipping the SQL Server Management Studio separately from SQL Server. So if I ran import module, SQL PS, then I get this error message. And actually, if you specified verbose, it would tell you that there's a command that uses encode, and there's a command that uses decode for the verb, and they're not approved verbs. And a lot of people complain like, hey, why didn't the SQL Server team get with the plan? Well, it's not their fault. The reason is they had those commands when they had a snap-in. So with SQL 2008 and 2008 R2, they had a snap-in instead of a PowerShell module. Well, it didn't do verb checking with snap-ins. So you would add the snap-in, which was the same thing as importing a module, and it wouldn't complain. So when they moved to a module, they had to keep their existing commands, or so they thought, which is why you get the error message. But now they've finally gotten with the plan and done what I've been telling them all along, and it's a lot of people have been saying this, not just me, that they should rename the command, but then create an alias with the old name. So that way you don't break existing scripts that are out in the field. Okay, so I'll show you the approved verbs. This is you just run get verb, and what I've done is sorted it by verb. A lot of this stuff, I've been working with SQL Server since SQL 6.5 back in the 90s. And it's back in the days when you could do insane stuff like put multiple databases that had nothing to do with one another in the same device, in the same file, you know, if anybody remembers that. Yeah, don't do that, bad idea. And you could put tempdb in RAM, and then you would get these lazy IO errors or something like that, if anybody remembers that. Yeah, I've been there, I've done that. So anyway, just to give you a background of my SQL experience, I've been doing SQL longer than PowerShell. But a lot of the stuff in PowerShell makes a lot of sense if you're writing transact SQL, because the way you're selecting stuff and you're using where object is what it's called in PowerShell, is very similar to SQL. And the other day I was trying to figure something out, and I was thinking in SQL terms, and I'm like, how can I do this in PowerShell? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've done that before, and I just kind of forgot. Anyway, so I've sorted this by verb, and then I piped it to out grid view, which is a graphical user interface. Now with PowerShell 5, when you're in out grid view, you can use Control+, so you don't need zoom it anymore to be able to zoom in. So you can see all the verbs. So when you're writing commands, make sure you use a verb from this. Now with scripts, you don't need to use these with scripts. Functions is what you need to use it for, or you'll get the nasty error message that you get today when you import the SQL module. It'll make your commands look unprofessional is what it would do. Okay, so the simplest function in the world. I'm not sure if you know this, but I'll run this command. So that's how I can get the PowerShell version. And even simpler is I can run just PS version table. So I can run PS version table, it'll give me more information. It'll tell me all the different versions of everything that's PowerShell related. And I can see the PowerShell version, you know, the build number and all of that. So anyway, to turn that simple command into the easiest function in the world is just declare it, say function, the name of the command, which is verb-noun, open and close curly brace, and then the command that you want to run. I'll load this. Now scoping works a little bit different in the ISC, which is what I'm in. And ISC stands for Integrated Scripting Environment. And it ships with all newer versions of Windows. It actually ships with Windows 7. And even if you install Windows Server 2012 R2 with the GUI, it installs by default with the GUI. One thing I found, if you're on Server Core and you tell Server Core to install the ISC because it's not there by default, you know what it does? It puts the entire GUI on your server. So don't do that. You don't need to run the GUI or the ISC on your server. So what I can do, then I have to call the function. And just to finish what I was saying about scoping, when you're in the ISC, everything's loaded in what's called the global scope. So it's actually, it doesn't work the same way it works in the console. In the console, you have a script scope and you have a global scope. So if I save this, if I take this here, and I save this as a script, and we'll put it in our demo folder that we're already in, and I'll just save it as, we'll save it as version because I want to show you the naming doesn't matter. So if I start typing in version and press tab, then it's going to tab complete it for me, and / is the current directory. So if I run that, and I've already loaded this command in the IC. When you do that, you can run get child item, and an alias for get child item is directory. So it's loaded on the function PS drive. So I can see it's there. So I just want to get rid of it. I could pipe it to remove item. I can also pipe it to DEL. So now if I check and see if it's there, it's not there, which is what I want, because now when I run this command, guess what? It's not there. The only command that starts with a V is get verb. What you have to do when you have functions in a script is you actually have to dot source it. So you put a dot, a space, and you run the command again. So now if I try to run that command, it's loaded in the global scope. So there it is. Something to be aware of, it's why I like putting my functions in modules. With PowerShell version 3 and higher, if you put your modules in the PS module path, which is an environment variable, is that. And to make it look a little cleaner, I can actually split it. So you can stick it in any one of these paths. It'll auto-load just by calling the function. Now in PowerShell 2, you had to import the module, not the function. Okay. So I could prefix it with PS version. The problem with that, the PowerShell team may have a similar command in the future. So I'll call it get Mr. PS version. And I've actually showed you that they're already on this drive. I'm going to go ahead and remove them. Verify they're removed, and they were. So do we have any questions at this point? This may be fairly advanced for new people to PowerShell. One thing I will tell you, I've sat through sessions in the past, and it was way, way over my head. And when I got done, I said, yeah, that was a waste of time. And anyway, later down the road, when I started working with this stuff, I was like, that's what he was talking about. So even though you may not get it here, you'll get it sooner or later if you keep working with PowerShell.
You lost me a little bit.
Sure.
The function part when you add it into the environment.
That is actually, I didn't actually add it to the environment. Are you talking about when I dot sourced it or when I showed you the environment variable?
The environment variable.
What that does, and I'll go ahead and I'll make it a little bit clearer. So I showed you all these paths.
Right.
So this command that I've written called version, instead of calling it version, I can actually take it, put it in documents, Windows PowerShell. There has to be a modules folder there. And whatever, I can call it my module. So this has to be named mymodule.psm1. So now if I go look at the command to make sure it's not on the function PS drive, oh, I removed them. They're gone. And that is, it is called get version. So now if I just call get version, it's actually going to load it from that automatically. So I don't have to run anything, I don't have to dot source anything, and I'll just go ahead and remove it again. Well, let me show you that it's there first. So if I show it to you on the function PS drive, and it is there because it was imported from the module this time. So I'm going to delete it, and this time I'll use the proper commandlet. So it does not exist. And if I run it again, I can actually even tab expand. It's magically loaded. And that was easier than going find, okay, where did I save this script, with the function in it, and so on. And even better than that, there's something called PowerShell Get. And what that is, you can create it, they have an external NuGet repository on the PowerShell gallery. It's not really, there are some things I will load from there, but not a lot of stuff because it's not, anybody from anywhere can load modules there. I have an internal private repository. So when I create this module, I upload it to that NuGet repository from PowerShell. And then my coworker can go download it from the repository. So it's an easy way to distribute modules where functions, maybe you got a function and he's got a function and they're out of sync and so on. But if anybody has any questions like this, feel free to ask.
Yeah, so is this a pretty typical way to organize your environment?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like kind of, is your personal organization preference or?
No, it's more or less the way the community does it.
Okay.
I wouldn't say, and there's actually a, in my resources slide, and also in the code here, there's a community best practices document. It's available on GitHub, and it's modified and updated by the community, and it has a lot of these things in there. And that's one of the ways that I won the scripting games several years ago, is by writing things following the community best practices. And I certainly don't know everything, don't get me wrong, but I'm very active on Twitter and different things. And like yesterday, I tweeted out, hey, is there an easier way to do this? And I tweeted my picture of my code out. So although I may be an MVP on this, nobody knows everything. If they tell you know everything, then you know one thing about them, that they're a liar. So let's talk a little bit about parameters now. Most of us write commands, especially when we're first getting started, that are very static. I want to do this on my SQL server, on SQL 01 for lack of a better name. Instead of doing that, parameterize your scripts. So this function here, I've defined this function, I've just run it from here so it is loaded just like we loaded the other ones. And now that when I run it, see, the only thing I did with this was outputted the computer names. But I can change the computer names here when I call the command. So it's dynamic. So it's not hard-coded in the command itself. And the other thing is make your parameters the same as the built-in PowerShell commands. When you look at the PowerShell commands, it's called computer name. It's not called server name, it's not called host, it's not called anything else, it's not called computer for the most part. And the way I determine that, don't take my word for it. I wrote a command that you can actually run here. It's going to tell me all the commands. So there's 55 commands that I have loaded that have a computer name parameter. 3 have a computer and 4 have a server name. Now, if you really want it to have server name, you can also define an alias. So you can define it with computer name and then define alias. So you can actually specify a computer name. But the reason to do this, you want to make your commands so that not only you can run them, because you want to go on vacation and you want to be able to leave your phone at home. So you want your coworkers, even though he may have never run your command, he's used PowerShell, he knows how the standard commands work. So you want standardized help and standardized parameters, just like any other PowerShell command. I've heard in sessions already today, to have a run book and to check your backups and do this and do that and do something else. And it sounded like a lot of manual work. And I'll be honest with you, if I can't automate it, I'm just not doing it. I'll tell my boss, I'll say, hey, I've been here over 10 years, I've been in IT over 20. You can get somebody off the street to do that point and click stuff, that I'm not doing. And if he tells me to hit the road, then I'll just go automate for somebody else, that's fine. I've kind of got a different mindset, but I automate everything. It doesn't matter, like, I restore a SQL database to a reporting environment every Friday night, and that's automated. I stop services, I restore the database, and we only do a full backup once a week, so it does the differentials. It goes in, it modifies the database, only certain people have access to the reporting environment. And to make this work, it's actually got to stop services on our application servers because it has the database in use. So, and also automate your testing. Make it easy for your coworkers to be able to write PowerShell code. Okay, so what I want to show you here, so I've got a computer name parameter. So I can start typing test Mr. Parameter, hit the dash, and you'll see it'll show up in IntelliSense. Funny thing, I hadn't coughed all morning until I got up here to speak. There's a few different ways to see the parameters. I can look at the syntax, and there's another way to see it as well. So what makes a function an advanced function? Commandlet binding. Too easy. That's it. One little command. What's that do for us? It's the same function I had before with one additional line. What I want you to notice, I type the same thing this time, I hit dash, look at all the parameters I have. Commandlet binding, or turning your function into an advanced function, gives you what's called common parameters. And you'll have a different number of common parameters depending on what version of PowerShell you're running. One of the main ones that I use is Verbose Output. I'm going to show you that as well. So if I look at the syntax the same way I did before, I can see here that I've got these common parameters. And there's another way to look at it as well, and you'll see that it's got an entire list of all the common parameters. So you can add, the verbose one is the one that it's easiest to show people, and all the other ones work similar. So I'm actually going to jump down here to the verbose output since that's what I'm talking about. I want you to notice this line here. This is an inline comment. Don't do that. Don't put inline comments in your scripts. Not for users. Now, if you're doing something that's out of the ordinary and you want a developer, and I use the developer term loosely, if you're writing scripts, you're a developer whether you want to be one or not. I'm not a developer either, but you are developing. So anyway, this will never be seen by the user of your command. And it'll probably, even though you update your code, you probably will never update that. That's the thing that's bad about documentation. Everybody preaches documentation, documentation, documentation. A lot of people do documentation, but rarely do people go back and update documentation after things change. So normally your documentation is stale. And I'll show you here, I'm using the verbose parameter. So when I run this command, and I actually didn't load this. So see, the function was not loaded. If you get an error message, read the error message, because more than likely it'll tell you the problem. There are some that don't tell you the problem. Don't just run the command and think you're going to get different results. So you'll see, it just gave me the output of the two server names. That's it. Well, I'll do this is what I've changed that inline comment to. Is I've said write verbose message and I put my message there.
What is that better than like write host?
Yes.
Okay.
In general, you shouldn't use write host because it only writes output to the screen.
Okay.
It doesn't produce objects. The only reason you would ever want to use write host is if you want colorized output on the screen, but this kind of does the same thing as well. For the most part, write host is considered to be a bad practice.
Okay.
But there are specific reasons to use it, but there's not very many.
Okay.
It wouldn't be there. That's one thing I always hear with SQL Server as well. It's like, oh, well, you should have this many temp DB files, and you should do this, and you should do that. And my question is always, why is it, if it should be that way, why isn't it that way out of the box? Why can't they go see how many cores is in the box and create that many temp DB files? But I guess we'd all be out of a job if they did that.
2016 does that, though.
There you go.
Well, already, it depends.
Okay. Yeah, I think, let's his name, Bob Ward, was here several years ago, and I sat through a session with him. And I asked him a question about TempDB. I said, does it really matter if I have more files if it's on the same physical disk? And he said, don't think about TempDB in terms of disk contention. Think of it in terms of a file contention, because you can only get so much I/O from a single file, even though it's on the same disk. So, just a sidebar. Okay, so I've loaded this command that's got the right verbose. Watch what happens. When I don't use the verbose parameter, I get normal output, which is what your users will normally see. If they're running something, they call you, they say, hey, I've got this error message. You can tell them, hey, run it with verbose. Guess what? Hey, get magic output, and it's colorized. You don't get to control the color, but. So, very handy, and people will actually see this. And it's also very helpful when you're writing commands, that you can write output for yourself. And since people will actually see it, when you update your code and you don't update this message, somebody's going to say, hey, you need to update that message. Okay. So we're about half done at this point. Now, support should process is even something that a lot of PowerShell people don't understand. I'm sure all you guys know what I'll call it a reggie is, a resume generating event. So if you write a command and it's going to make a change, like you're going to drop a table from a database or drop a database, you should probably have a way to run the command and let it tell you what it's going to do before you actually do it. And that's what support should process does. It adds what if and confirm support to your own commands. So you only need this if your command is going to make changes. We're working with a very small command because I found that a lot of people, they'll show you 100 lines and they'll try to explain something that's very small in there, but the code they're showing you is so overwhelming that you can't see the trees for the forest. Okay, so we've loaded that command. Now when I start typing the command and I put a dash, notice the second, third option is what if and confirm. Now if the commands you have placed inside your function already support what if and confirm, then your job is done. It's automatic. But if you're using something like the .NET framework, they don't support what if and confirm by default, then you have to write code that would actually run the command without really running it. It's almost like, I do a lot of unit testing on my code, and if you know what mocking is, you're almost mocking the command is really what you're doing. So now if I look at the same thing I've showed you before, the syntax, you can see I've got what if and confirm there. And if I look at it the other way as well, you'll see it there. So what I want you to realize with a lot of this is just know that it's there. So when you get to the point that you need it, you're like, yeah, I remember something about that. Parameter validation is very important. Why would you write a command, whether you're writing it in PowerShell or SQL or whatever? Would you want to write a command that goes through and modifies a lot of stuff, and the user didn't provide everything that's necessary, and it gets halfway and it fails? What if you went to the ATM machine and you got $20 or $100 out? Because 100's like 20 used to be, you know. And it deducted it from your account, but it didn't spit any money out. You wouldn't be too happy. So that's what I'm talking about. Don't run half a command. You want a full transaction like in SQL. You want it to roll back, basically, if it doesn't complete. So what parameter validation does, though, it stops it dead in its tracks. And by using the built-in parameter validation in PowerShell, any validation that you write is going to be the same or similar to the validation I'll write. It's not some custom function that you're going to run it through, and it's going to be hard for somebody to troubleshoot behind you. So if I run this command now, the validation I've added here, a lot of people don't call this validation, but it is. I've typed my computer name as a string. I've specified a data type. With SQL Server people, you guys understand data types. But I've specified a single string, not an array of strings. So if I run my command with a single server name, hey, it works great. I didn't intend this command to be run with multiple server names. So if I run it with 2 server names, guess what? You got an error message. Nope, not allowed. Now the problem is I can now run this command with no computer names, and that's not really what I designed this for. So there's a parameter attribute for mandatory. So not only is it only going to allow a single string, but it's going to make it mandatory. This code here is written to be PowerShell 3 and higher compliant. If I wanted it a simple fix to make it 2.0 and compliant, would be to add $true. That would make it 2.0 compliant. To me, I like the 3.0 style because you specify it's true. You don't specify it's false. Because I see a lot of people specifying this and saying false. There's no reason to write that code because that's the default. And a lot of people make the argument, hey, it's not hurting anything. Well, actually it is, because it's more code that I have to sift through and I have to troubleshoot behind you. So don't write code that doesn't do anything. Okay, so we'll go ahead and load this. We'll run the command again. We won't specify a server name. Guess what? Hey, we got prompted. Now we can, we'll just say SQL 01. That's it. One name, end of story. Okay, slight change. I'll put a set of square brackets. So that tells it it can take an array of strings, which means it can accept more than one computer name. So now if I define that function, I run the command with no computer names, notice it's got computer name 0. If I say SQL 01 and press enter, it's asking for another one. SQL 02. It's going to keep asking until you hit enter. Okay, so now default values do not work with mandatory parameters. So maybe you want to specify a default if somebody doesn't give you a default value. So I'll go ahead and show you this. I run the command. Guess what? It still prompts me. Well, what I'm looking for is when somebody doesn't give it a computer name, it's going to run against this computer. And what environment computer name is the local computer. And it's a more dynamic way of specifying, like local host, or even in PowerShell, you can specify a dot. But those are also considered to be a bad practice. What you want to use instead of mandatory is validate not null or empty. And I want to show y'all something real quick because we're jumping through a lot of things here, and you'll get back and you'll say, yeah, I don't remember any of that. Well, you know what? I don't write all these different validations all the time either, so you don't have to memorize anything in PowerShell. So you open up the IC, and this is the default. I haven't changed anything. Control-J. I normally go down to the complete advanced function. I hit enter, and guess what? That gives me a template. I can see here's validate not null or empty. So I could copy and paste, but I would advise you not to copy and paste. If you have multiple monitors, open up the IC twice and look at it on one screen and type it in on the other. Because just the fact of typing it in will make you learn the commands and the syntax. It's kind of like when you were in school and you had spelling words and you had to write them like 500 times. Well, you learn those words, and it's the same sort of thing. You know, kids, they probably don't even do that stuff nowadays, you know. I'm an old guy. And hey, if I can do PowerShell, you guys can do it too. Okay, so if I run this command and I run it without specifying a computer name, now that I specified validate not null or empty, guess what? The computer I'm on is called PC01. And if I ran just this little part of this command, it would tell me the same thing. So now if I specify the server names, guess what? It doesn't give me PC01. It gives me the ones I specified. Make everything you can dynamic. Don't static things. I've seen people, they'll write 50,000 functions or scripts, and this one's hard-coded to this server, that server, the next server, and the next server. parameterize it, make it a function. If you want to make a caller script and call it through the script, that's fine. But the problem is when you write 1,000 lines of code and you write it for every server in your environment, you're creating technical debt for yourselves. Because guess what? When there's a change to that code, you got to go to all those scripts and change it all instead of changing it one time. Okay, there's also what's called enumerations. Very simple, they're predefined in PowerShell. And the reason I'm showing this and the next thing is a lot of people write a lot of code to do this sort of stuff when it's already built into PowerShell. So when I run test Mr. console color validation, it'll give me all the valid console colors. I can actually specify the color parameter and it'll come back with those. Now I'm going to specify one that's invalid. So immediately, the command doesn't even run, it immediately says, hey, that's invalid input. Nope, not accepting it. Now the other thing it buys you when you use an enumeration is I can say color, and when I hit the space bar, guess what? They're all in IntelliSense. Okay. You can get a list of enumerations here. I've got a command that I've got a link here that I've downloaded that a friend of mine, Warren Frame, who goes by the Cookie Monster on Twitter, wrote. Those are all the enumerations. So there's lots of enumerations that are already built for you. Don't write unnecessary code. So like the days of the week, and there's other ways to get the days of the week, but there they are. They're in enumeration. Okay, how many times have you seen people write all these complicated regular expressions and everything to validate an IP address? Guess what? There's actually a type accelerator. It looks like an enumeration, but it's not. And all it is, hey, this. That's it. It's kind of like when I type something as a string, it's the same thing. Type it as an IP address. There's a type accelerator. What that does, I can actually test, say, hey, is this a valid IPv4 address? Yes, it is. It gives me a lot of information about it. Is this valid? No, it's not. This same command, without writing any more code, will validate, is this an IPv6 address? Yes, it is. Is this a valid one? No, it's not. There's a way to get the type accelerators also. I always hate when somebody shows me something and then they show me like the ones for the IP addresses. It's like, well, how did you figure out how to do that? Well, there's actually a command to find all of those because maybe you want one for something else like an email address. There's one for an email address. So those are all the type accelerators. If you have the PowerShell community extensions installed, which I don't on this VM, there's actually a shorter command you can run. Okay, we've covered verbose output. Pipeline input. Pipeline input is where in PowerShell you can pipe one command to another one. And it's very simple. For those of you who don't understand this concept or haven't used it before, I can run, say, get service, and I can specify a name. The reason I like tab expansion, because you notice I didn't put a space in there and I hit tab, it didn't tab expand. That means I typed something wrong. And I can say, actually it's W32 time. So the time service, it's actually stopped. So I can just run start service. And this is very basic. And it's telling me it can't start that service. Let's get another one just in case there could be something on this VM that's preventing it from running. So the bit service is running. That's one that you'll see in a lot of examples. So I'll just run stop service. And then if I get the service again, now it's stopped. There's other ways to do that as well, and I won't cover that in here because that is a very basic concept, but I want you to understand what I'm talking about when I say pipeline input. So there's always two plans to pipeline input. There's plan A and plan B, and what I mean by that is plan A is always is always by type is what I call it. And plan B is by name, by property name. And I'll explain that a little bit better. A lot of people, they'll call this one by value, but I don't call it by value because a lot of programmers confuse that with memory addresses in like C#. So we'll load that into memory. This won't work because what I've done, actually this one will work. Because this is by type. These are strings. Yeah, so those two work. So I just piped those two commands in and it outputted the names. Very simple. Not trying to overcomplicate things. So now what I'm going to do is create a custom object that contains the same information, but it's actually named computer name. Some versions of PowerShell, if you tried to pipe that to this command, will give you an error. This will just give you some weird output. So to accept something by property name, it's value from pipeline by property name. So now we can actually define this command. If I pipe the first one, see, we'll actually get an error because I'm no longer accepting by type. It's got to be by name. So now if I pipe the object I previously created to it, it works fine now. Well, we can have the best of both worlds. We can actually specify both, as you can see in this command. So then either one would work. So you may be wondering, why not do this to every command? Well, by type, you can only, if you've got 10 strings, you can only accept input from a string on one parameter, not on all the parameters, because you can't, it wouldn't know what string to bind it to unless they were in different parameter sets. Okay, and this actually looks like the same command that we ran before. So I'm not sure why it's in here twice. Let's take a look at it just in case. I may have actually, I think I just scrolled up. Oh, I know what I did here. This is different. What this is, when you have pipeline input, you have to have a parameter, a process block. Now there's a begin block, there's a process block, and there's an end block. And begin block is set up for your command. You can't use what's piped in the begin block. It's not available yet. And the process block is going to be executed one time for everything you send in through the pipeline. So if I ran get service and got all the services, it's going to run this process block one time for every single one of those services. It's like a for-each loop. And then the end block is normally cleanup. So if I, for example, opened up a SQL connection to a SQL server and I ran all these queries in the process block, and then I actually need to close that SQL connection and dispose of the object so that I'm not burning up memory on the machine. So anyway, what I want to show you here is I'm trying to output the computer name in the begin block. So it should say test in the computer name, and notice it does not. Also specify two computer names, and it only returned it for the last one. I'll pipe the object to it, I'll get the same output. One thing I've learned when you're demonstrating this, don't run both commands together, or you'll get both outputs together and it will actually appear as if the command worked because you get two of them. So what really needs to happen is this really needs to be process. You almost always have a process block, but a lot of times you will not have a begin block or a end block. So now you'll notice I got test in the computer name for both of them because the process, like as I said, the process block runs once for each item in the pipeline. That's actually a very hard concept to understand, so I'm not going to go any deeper on that concept. It's just something that if you accept pipeline input on your command, there's more plumbing, as I'll call it, that needs to be done to the command. The other thing is once you accept pipeline input, I believe this, well, if I tried to put some command here, and so what I was thinking may not be right. So I'll just continue. I don't want to tell you something that's incorrect. So error handling. So we've got about 10 more minutes. With error handling, it's very confusing to a lot of people. Try catch finally is what I use. There's an older way in PowerShell 1 to do it. You can still use that, but I wouldn't recommend it. The biggest problem that people run into with error handling is try catch finally only works with terminating errors. And there are lots of errors in PowerShell that are not terminating. But you can turn a non-terminating error into a terminating one, which is what you need to do. It's the magic. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. So notice I'm running this command test wsman computer name. I run that against my domain controller. Hey, it runs great. I run it against a machine that doesn't exist in the domain controller. I got an unhandled exception. So now what I'll do is what I should do, I'll wrap it in try catch. And this is as far as most people get. So I'm trying something, and you would think if it generates an error, it would be caught. But it's not caught. So we'll run the same command again. We'll get the same results. The thing is, I need this here. I need error action stop. That's the magic. Now, if you're using a command line or a function, usually error action stop is going to be built in. But if you're using the .NET framework, it's not going to be built in, and there's actually an error action preference variable. But the scope of it is like global scope, like I was talking about earlier. You don't really want to change it in the global scope, but you have no other choice. So the thing to do is change it to stop, run your command, and then change it back to continue, which is the default. So if I went down to the command line here, see there's an error action preference, and see the default is continue. And even better than what I just told you is check to see what it is first, store that in a variable, and then when you're done, set it back to what it was, so that you're not just arbitrarily setting it to continue in case some other process has already modified it. It's little bits of information like that determines if you're if you're really an amateur or a professional at writing PowerShell code. So now what happens, I'm actually going to handle it, and I'm only going to generate a warning. So now, wasn't that a lot nicer and a lot prettier? Okay. I've got help topics in here. You can run these commands. Notice they're commented out. Although they're commented out, you can select everything but the pound sign. And if you didn't, I'm not sure how long this will take here. If you didn't know, the pound sign is it's actually, the technical name for that is an octothorpe. So the things I know, you know. I could have used that block of memory for some useful information. Okay, we're almost done. Comment-based help. If nobody knows how to use your commands, they're worthless. You can write the best PowerShell code in the world, but you have to write help. And it should be comment-based help, which is what this is. Now, if I went over here, you'll see they actually have comment-based help in this example. Theirs is before the function. I like putting mine inside the function. The reason is I don't have to see the help doesn't compress with the function. And also, if you've got multiple functions inside a module, then it could be confusing. And also, there's an issue if you leave too many lines between the help and the function that it won't work properly. So my recommendation is put it inside the help. But whoever wrote this help, and this is built in for Microsoft, so yeah, I am talking bad about them. But I have a high attention to detail. And notice they typed this in proper case, and all these other ones with the dots were in uppercase. So if you're going to use this, change that, please. It's like, have you ever looked at like a medical record system or something, and depending on who was working that day, this person's name's in lowercase, and the next person is in proper case, and the next one's in uppercase? Yeah, that's not good. What really should happen, and that's not really an end user problem, it's really a developer problem, because they should actually take that input that the user, because they're data entry, I mean, they're making Wendy's wages, what can you expect? But the developer should actually take and parse that output and should case it properly before it's put into the system. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Okay, so what I've done here, so I've got this help, and then I would have the function body. What that allows me to do is very similar to what I just showed you. Just like any other command, I can run help on my function. And I can actually, it works just like any other command that ships from Microsoft. Okay, so I've got a lot of things in here. I'm going to jump back to the slide deck. And this does end at 9:30, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure I wasn't running over.
We've got 4 minutes. Good.
So we've got just enough time to finish the slide deck. Not a big fan of PowerPoint. One thing I do know, Shift F5 gets you back to where you were. Can't tell you how many presenters that they'll start from the beginning and they'll be paging through their slides. Let this gentleman get a picture of this. No problem. I've only got like 2 more slides. That's the style guide I was talking about, PowerShell.org. If you have any questions, I mean, I certainly don't mind answering your questions, but there's forums on PowerShell.org, and they are going through an upgrade this weekend, so they may be unavailable. There are people such as me, because I actually get an email. Every time somebody asks a question on the forums, I get an email. So yeah, of course, I have a rule set up. But it's like a contest, and you also get different perspectives from different people, which is really good, and that builds up to, okay, this is what the community believes, not just what Mike believes. Okay, you've got PowerShell Virtual Chapter SQL Pass, who is run by a couple of SQL, well, actually, one is Aaron Nelson, who is here today. He's one of the people who run that. You got the Microsoft Virtual Academy. You got some great videos. PowerShell Magazine, I've written some articles for them. User groups. I run a virtual user group that meets on the second Tuesday of every month at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. We record our videos. They're on YouTube. And these slides, all of this is available on GitHub. Twitter. You wouldn't believe how useful Twitter is. I worked with Dell on a server problem. We spent a month. They replaced the system board. They replaced everything in the machine. It was a Hyper-V server. I spent in less than 15 minutes on Twitter. I had the problem fixed. And they had put thousands of dollars in, and we had lost thousands of dollars. So I tweeted the problem out, and it was actually some virtual queues on the network adapters, and it's specific to Broadcom and the model of the server. What I learned is don't put Broadcom NICs in your servers. Blogs. If you go out to my blog, mikefrobbins.com, or an easier way to get there, since I said all my stuff is Mr., an alias for my blog is mrpowershell.com. I have a blog role, and I only put people on there that write great code and blog often. If they start not blogging or they start writing garbage, I delete them off of it. Pester is the unit testing framework I was talking about. Since we didn't get to that, this is a link to their wiki. Git is source control. It's what I recommend. You can actually use it directly from inside PowerShell. You can use the command line interface. I'll be speaking at SQL Saturday Pensacola in 2 weeks on desired state configuration. I'll be speaking at Chattanooga on June 25th on creating unconventional SQL Server tools in PowerShell. It's actually a similar session that I presented at the PowerShell Summit about a month ago in Seattle. And last but not least, there's all my contact info. The 2 books I referenced at the beginning of the session that I've co-authored or contributed chapters to. If you want my real email address, go to my About page. And my email address is encrypted, so you can decrypt it. It's not real difficult encryption to crack, but decrypt it with PowerShell and send me an email. I have an alias for the blog for the user group as well at cmspowershell.com, since we're the Mississippi PowerShell user group. And thank you for attending my session.